Good afternoon. Welcome back to another rendition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. You are tuned into the Portrait Series with Tony Gale. Today, we are diving into part 2, how to create a portrait in studio. Pretty self-explanatory, Tony, right?
You would think so. I mean, you just find a studio and you take a picture of someone.
Hey,
You know,
workshop
that's
over.
it. That's it, right? If you want the abridged version, you're done.
There you go. For the detailed version, we're going to turn that over to the man himself, Sony Artisan of Imagery, Tony Gale. Huge thank you, of course, to Sony for hosting today's event. And as always, we invite your questions. Don't be shy. Don't wait until the end for the Q&A. Throw them in at any time, and we'll get to them before this hour is over. Tony, take it away.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. I am Tony Gale. I am a Sony Artisan of Imagery. For many of you, that's probably not a surprise. If you haven't seen me before, hi, welcome. Today, we're doing part 2 of the portrait series, studio portraits. In addition to being a Sony Artisan of Imagery, I'm also a BenQ ambassador, a Manfrotto ambassador, and an X-Rite Colorati, in case any of those brands come up. And in case you're wondering who I am, besides all of that, I'm a commercial people and portrait photographer based here in New York City. I shoot a bunch of stuff for editorial, corporate, and advertising clients. Also, coming up, we have a bunch of stuff, parts 3 and 4 of this, a splashes and pours, a lesson and critique series where I'll do a lesson on speedlights on location. And then the next week, next week, we will critique images that people submit of their portrait pictures of speedlights on location or with speedlights on location. We're also going to do an experimenting with photography and then a critique of experimenting with photography. And then additionally, we have 2 photo walks scheduled. We had one last week. We have one next week, the Central Park waterfalls. And then in June, we're going to do a portrait photo walk in Lower Central Park. All of this is either on or will soon be on the B&H Event Space website. I think the later stuff isn't up yet, but certainly everything in May is. Additionally, if you just can't get enough of cool Sony people, I may not be that cool, but I know some cool Sony people. Autumn Schrock is doing yoga for photographers with Sony on May 15th, as well as shooting landscapes with telephoto lenses on May 22nd. And Scott Robert Lim is doing cinematic weddings with constant light on May 23rd. So there's a bunch of cool Sony people doing some fun stuff. And then a bunch of stuff I always go over at the beginning for those of you who aren't aware. If you're interested in photography or all things Sony or anything like that, Sony's Alpha Universe is a free site where you can learn all sorts of stuff. You can see some cool things. Even if you don't use Sony cameras, there's still a bunch of cool stuff about photography. You can still see some amazing work. Additionally, I've mentioned this, but haven't shown it. If you are in Alpha Universe, there is a community gallery. You can sign up for that and submit your work. And it's another way for your work to be seen, and it's another way to see some cool stuff out there. That's under Community Gallery. And there's the Sony Alpha Universe forums, also accessible through Alpha Universe, where you can ask questions, get inspired, comment on things, show people how smart you are, anything like that, all available on the Alpha Universe forums. And there is the Alpha Female Plus Facebook group, which is continuing to do a $500 micro grant every week based on a specific topic. If you go to the Alpha Universe Facebook group or Alpha Female Plus Facebook group, you can find out more. You do not need to identify as female to win, but you do have to be a good person. You have to be a nice person, or they won't let you in. It's good to be a good person. But now we're going to move on. So studio portraits. I mentioned this last time, and I'm going to mention it again, which is why do a portrait photo shoot with all the new technology that's becoming available, where if you just want to take a random picture of a random person doing a random thing, you can do that with AI. That is true. You can do that with AI. It's not a photograph, it's an illustration, although I've seen people get quite heated with that conversation. But to me, a portrait is a picture of a specific person for a specific reason. If I photograph someone, if I photograph Derek, it's because I want to photograph Derek. I want to capture something of Derek, and doing that with AI isn't the same, especially because you have so little control over it. So you can do some incredible stuff with AI, but it's not the same. I would still rather have a photograph of a person. It's a little bit like when photography came out, there were painters who thought painting was dead, but painting is still there because it does something special that photographs don't. Photographs do something special that AI doesn't. So that's why I still think portrait photography has value. I would rather have a real picture of a real person or make a real picture of a real person, even or in a real place, than create something that is inspired by that person. But it depends on what you want to do. So studio portraits. Roughly, we're going to talk about what is a studio, finding a studio, planning, gear, and lighting, even though gear and lighting and planning all sort of jumble together. We have to put this in some order, so we'll jump around a little bit. So start with, what is a studio? So you may have people disagree. Reasonable minds can disagree. Unreasonable minds can disagree too. And that's true for everything I say. I'm going to give you what I think. I'm going to tell you how I approach things. If you have a different way and it works for you, fantastic. If somebody else told you a different way that you think is better, that's great. In photography in general, there are very few things that are absolutes. And if, doing things this way works, great. If doing things this way works, great. If you want to try some of each and see what works, that's great. But generally, if someone says this is the only way, there's some limited exceptions, but I disagree. All right, so a studio is a place you can control. Classically, that would be a space that you go to that is set up as a photo studio. You can control the lighting, you can move stuff around. But if you have a spare room in your house, or you could set up what is effectively a studio in your living room, in your garage, a studio doesn't have to be someplace that is 100% a studio all the time. It just has to be a place that you can control so that there's nothing in the frame that isn't there because you want it to be, and that the lighting is under your control. So this, for example, studio shot, except this was done in a very expensive condo's living room, but the living room was empty. All that was in it was my lighting and a giant roll of paper, a giant roll of white seamless. This was in an office, Salman Rushdie's agent's office, but it's effectively a studio. I controlled the background, I could control the lighting. None of the lights in the room mattered. So ideally, it's someplace that's empty that you can control, but effectively a studio can be many things. Also, in a perfect world, just to get really, really nerdy with lighting, if you want the most control, you need a large room with black ceiling and black walls, because light will bounce around on light colored walls. To the best you can, you want to avoid anything with a tone to the wall. So white, gray, black, you can work with that. If the walls are green or purple or yellow or red, it's going to be challenging because you're going to get light bouncing off of those, and it's going to affect the photograph you're taking because of that reflected color. All right. So we know what a studio is. Now we want to find a studio. There's the obvious thing, right? Just photo studio rental, your city, see what shows up on Google. Depending on where you are, there may or may not be stuff. Some smaller cities, you may not find anything. Another option that you might consider is looking for rehearsal spaces. Even if there aren't photo studios, there might be rehearsal spaces for musicians or for actors. And sometimes those spaces can work as a studio. Additionally, there are a couple of websites I use quite a bit. I have no affiliation with Peerspace or with Splicer, the other site I'm going to show you. I've used them both to find studios and locations, but I have no relationship with them. They may work for you, they may not. That's up to you, buyer beware. But you can go on there and say you're looking for a studio. It'll give you a bunch of stuff. In the New York City area, there's a lot of stuff. You can look by price point, you can look by size, you can look by features. There's a ton of options. Splicer is similar, except Splicer, I don't think you can specify studio. It just is going to give you photo shoot spaces. And I will talk about these on the next one too, when we're talking about location, because I often use them more to find a location to shoot in rather than a studio, but they do work for studios. And then some of the things to think about when you're looking for a studio that can be overlooked, because anything can be overlooked, right? Is there parking? You know, if you're renting a studio and you're driving there with a bunch of gear and the only parking is on the street and it's all taken all the time, you got to have a solution, right? If I'm using a studio in the city, I have to bring a cart to carry my gear because the likelihood that I can park in front of a studio is almost none. And honestly, if I'm in a studio in Manhattan, I just take a cab. I put my gear in a cab and I take the cab or car service. I don't drive. But if it's somewhere else, I may drive. If there's no parking, you want to plan for that. If there is parking, you want to know how that works. Is there an elevator? Do you need a freight elevator? Some buildings may require you with a bunch of stuff to go up the freight, if there is a freight. And if that's the case, you want to plan ahead and know what the procedure is for that. Maybe they need insurance, who knows? You just don't want to get there and be surprised. And at the very least, you want there to be an elevator. I have used studios that are second and third floor walk-ups, and that is really a drag where you go up there, there's 2 giant stairwells in front of you, and you've got to carry all your stuff up that. That's not fun. What's the schedule for the studio? With the more high-end studios that you might use for a commercial shoot, the clock starts as soon as the first person walks into the studio. So if you booked a studio from 9 to 5 for a shoot for a client, and your assistant or the makeup artist shows up at 8:30 and goes into the studio, the clock started at 8:30. So you want to make sure that you know what the schedule is. You want to make sure you understand how the billing is going to work. And you want to make sure that everybody involved knows if the clock starts when the first person goes in, not to go in until that time comes. Is there outlets? Are there power? Some of the less expensive studios have very few outlets, but you're going to want to know that if you're going to plug things in. If you're using battery powered lights, less of an issue, or just daylight. But if you're using anything that plugs into the wall and there's only 2 outlets in the space, you need to know that and bring extension cords or splitters so that you can do that. Does the studio have rental gear? You know, some studios will include some things, maybe some light stands or sandbags or lighting. Some of the more high-end studios will have a rental room where you can rent lights and all of that stuff. But what's available there to be rented if you need it, if anything, and what's there that you can use, if anything. Like if you don't have to bring light stands, that's really nice. Light stands are a drag to carry around. If all you have to do is bring your lights and whatever modifiers you like, that's great. Some studios have lights, and if you like those lights, that's great too. I almost never use the lights that are available in studios for free, just because I'd rather use my own stuff that I know I can control. Is there a changing area? Some of them have it, some of them don't. You know, you just want to be able to solve that problem. I have had to walk out into a hallway so somebody could change. Is there a cyc? A cyc is a hard surface that goes from the floor to the wall in a curve. It's a cyclorama so that you can't see the corner. Some studios have a cyc, some don't. Do you want one? Is there seamless that you can use or not? This is just some of the things to think about. You want to make sure when you're planning that you know what is there and what you need to bring. All right, so for planning, let's say you're photographing a specific person for a specific purpose. You're photographing Bob the chef because Bob the chef is starting a new website. You're only booking Bob the chef. You don't need other people to photograph because Bob the chef is the person you're photographing. If he doesn't show up, there's no shoot because he was the whole purpose of the shoot. On the other hand, I sometimes will schedule people to photograph just because I want to photograph new people. In those instances, I will often double or triple book because I have found that people can be flaky. I know it's a shock. You heard it here first. No one has ever said it before, but sometimes people are flaky. So I have found if I have a person scheduled at 1 and then another person scheduled at 3 and then another person scheduled at 5, it's not uncommon for one of those people to cancel or not show up at the last minute. And then let's say it's that 3 o'clock person. I booked a studio from 1 to 6 or 7. So I'm paying for the studio for that time. I photographed the person at 1, the person at 3 at 2:30 sends me an email saying they can't make it. Now I've got nothing to do until 5 and I'm paying for that space. That is really a drag. I know photographers can be flaky too. I've heard that from people I photographed, but I'm just assuming none of us are flakes. So What I'll do is schedule 2 or 3 people at 1 and 2 or 3 people at 3 and 2 or 3 people at 5 or whatever the times are, so that at least one person shows up. And if everybody shows up, I'll just alternate between people. So I'll do a setup with person A, they'll go change or whatever. I'll photograph person B, then I'll photograph person C, and then person A comes back. We do a different setup or a different outfit, photograph them again, and just rotate through people. It can be exhausting doing that, but it's certainly better than sitting around wishing that you were photographing somebody who's not there. So think about the schedule, think about how many people you're booking. You may want to consider a mood board. A mood board is basically a grid of a bunch of pictures that are inspiring the shoot. Could be wardrobe, it could be lighting, but sometimes it helps the people you're photographing or the people you're working with. If you're working with a crew, a makeup artist, a wardrobe stylist, a prop stylist, it helps them understand what the goal is so that everybody's on the same page. You know, if you're putting a lot of time and effort into a shoot with a specific idea, it helps if everyone understands that idea rather than just saying, you know, we want to do high fashion. People talk about high fashion all the time. I'm not sure that many people understand what high fashion is. I'm borderline on it myself, but there's certainly different interpretations of what that means. And so if you just say it's a high fashion shoot, what people may bring, you know, the makeup they might wear, the clothing they might wear, may not be what you had in mind because it's not clear. So if you say high fashion and then you have a bunch of pictures as an examples in a mood board, that helps people understand what you mean. All right, so then you've got your camera gear. I would recommend, especially if you're putting money into this, if you have 2 cameras, bring one. If you can borrow a second camera, bring it. Just as a backup, you never know. It's not unheard of for somebody to knock your camera on the floor or to drop something. I had a camera on a tripod over my shoulder that I hadn't put the quick release plate on all the way, and it fell off and the lens broke off. It all got repaired, but in the meantime, I didn't have that lens. The camera was okay, fortunately. So think about what camera you want to bring. Make sure that you have a backup if you can. I know it can be expensive and we're not all fortunate enough to do that. I, for years, only had one digital camera because it's all I could afford. So currently I'm using the Alpha 7R5, the Alpha 1. Those are my 2 primary cameras. But I have an Alpha 7R4 as a backup and an Alpha 7R3 if I really need it. Also Alpha 7C. So just think about that. Think about what lenses you want to bring. I've talked before about zooms. If you think you're going to go from full length to tight portraits and back and forth, a nice 2470 GM2 zoom, 24-105 zoom can be really, really useful. Some of the primes are fantastic. I really actually like the 70-200 GM2 as a portrait lens. The 135 is incredible. The 100 is incredible. There's a lot of options out there. You just want to think about what those are. Maybe you like to shoot wide angle. Maybe you only want to bring a 35mm. Whatever you want to do is fine. There is no one right answer, but you want to think about it. You want to think about the size of the space you're in. If you're in a small space, you're going to need wider lenses. If you're in a huge space, you can bring those lenses. If I'm in sometimes I'm in studios that are 15 by 20 feet, which is quite small. The 135 is really tight for that. I can do a headshot, but really not anything else because I can't get back far enough. But if I'm in a larger studio, the 135 GM is a beautiful lens. It just depends on what you need. All right, so you've got your camera and lenses. So you want to think about some other gear. You want to bring extra cards. Always bring extra cards. It is really, really a drag if you fill up all the cards you have on you and there's still more pictures you want to take. And you start having to go through and delete individual pictures and it takes forever. And what if you deleted the wrong one? Just bring extra cards. I use the Sony Tough cards, both the CF Express Type A and the SD. Bring extra batteries, bring a charger. Same thing, you just want extra batteries because you don't want that to be the thing that ends the shoot. A computer if you want to tether, if you want to go over things in real time. Light stands if you need them. Tripod if you want it. Lights, are you bringing lights? Do they have lights there? Extension cords, maybe they have them, maybe they don't. I will say I've been to plenty of studios that have light stands and extension cords, and the light stands, some of them work and some of them are missing knobs. There's extension cords, but they're all tangled up. So depending on the situation, you might want to bring your own. A Bluetooth speaker is always a great idea. I love the XB13 because I can just put it in my camera bag all the time. I really love the SRS XE300. I don't understand the naming, but great speaker. And this is something that I just realized a year ago still exists. It's my absolute favorite thing. For years, I used iPods because I'd rather that music be on a dedicated device rather than on my phone. So if I'm playing music on a shoot, it doesn't get interrupted if I have to make a call or if I receive a call. They don't make regular iPods anymore. Sony still makes the Sony Walkman. It's an MP3 player. I have the NWA305. I actually have 2 of them. This is a new one that's coming out soon. I just learned about it today when I did the screenshot. It's high definition audio. It's got 16 gigabytes on board, but you can put a micro SD card on it. Absolutely love it. It connects via Bluetooth to your speaker. One of my favorite things. I think everybody should have these. All right. Now we're going to think about lighting. So window light, constant light, strobe or flash. So window light, we all know what window light is. There's a window, there's no blinds, light comes in, that's window light. It can be beautiful. It can also be limited because you can't control the sun, right? The window, there's a fly buzzing around. The window faces the direction it faces, or the windows. If it's sunny, there's more light coming in. If it's cloudy, there's less light coming in. If it gets late in the day or early in the morning before the sun is up, you're limited. So window light can be beautiful. And there are studios that build themselves as daylight studios. And it can be great, but it is limiting. If you're going to shoot with the idea of only daylight, I would still bring extra lights just in case, because you never know. And then we have continuous light or constant light. So there's a huge range of this. There's LEDs, there's fluorescent, there's tungsten, there's HMI and plasma lights. Most of us aren't going to use HMI or plasma lights, especially now. HMIs are used a lot on film sets. They're very, very expensive, and LEDs and other things have gotten so good that for the most part, especially with the high ISOs we can do with cameras now, most of us probably aren't going to use an HMI. Fluorescence used to be quite common. I think LEDs have largely replaced fluorescence, but not entirely. And then tungsten lights are the least expensive, but they do get hot and they can be more fragile. So I use tungsten lights, I use LEDs. I used to have some fluorescent banks, but I don't use them anymore. And a long time ago, assisting, I used HMIs a lot, working with other photographers, but not in a long time. You know, the right tool for you depends on whatever your budget is and what you can, what you're interested in doing. And then additionally, you have strobe lights, strobe or flash lighting. It's got more power than any of the constant light sources in that it can freeze motion more easily. It's brighter. If you're shooting very, very quickly, it may or may not be able to keep up depending on how expensive of a strobe you have. There's monolights, which are lights that just plug directly into the wall or have a battery. There's power packs and heads where there's a pack that plugs into the wall and then a head that plugs into the pack. There's remote trigger strobes. That's more of a specialty thing. I primarily use monolights. I do have a couple of packs and heads still that I'll use when I need more power, because if you need a lot of power, power packs have more power than a monolight. The average highest power monolight that I think is currently available right now is 1,000 watts. And you can get power packs with 2,400 watts. So, and then of course, there's also speed lights. So I actually really love the Sony speed lights. I use the 60 RM2 and the 46 RM and the 28 RM. Those can be in a studio, especially very useful because you're controlling the light. So the fact that they have less power than a monolight may not matter because you aren't having to overpower the light that's there. If you're looking for a speed light, I really recommend making sure that it's one. If you're looking at Sony, for example, the R in the RM stands for radio. Get one that has a radio built in, because if you're going to use it off camera remotely, the radios have a lot more control and they're more reliable than the ones that just use optical. All right, so just to give you some examples of different kinds of lighting, so you'll have a better sense of what we're talking about. This is a studio in Midtown. daylight coming in from the window. So window light, same person, same studio, different part of the studio. This is a 4 by 6 foot softbox. So you can see the quality of light, meaning the shape of the light is very different. The window light, beautiful. I can only control it so much. This, I can change the power. I can make the power brighter or darker. I can move the light around. I can raise it or lower it. Window light, strobe. This is a situation where I had set up for this particular shot with the strobe on the right with a big 5-foot octabank. And then I noticed this light coming in and I thought, oh, that looks cool. So I turned off the strobe and just had the person I was photographing look towards the window. If she had been looking straight at the camera, and I should have done this just as an example, because that light is coming in so much from the side, it would have probably been a terrible portrait light. So just pay attention to the angle of that light. Window light, window light. This is continuous light. This is 2 1x1 LEDs, also 2 1x1 LEDs, 2 1x1 LEDs. Things like that can be great. They don't have a lot of coverage. So for type portraits, a smaller LED like a 1x1 can be great if you're trying to photograph a whole person. So here I've got Robin Quivers that I photographed for a magazine. The 2 1x1s, this was actually set up for video and I just thought it was a cool photo. You can see her face is very well lit, but the fall off is quite rapid. You know, if you're trying to use about 1x1 to light an entire person, it has to be so far back that it's not very bright. 1x1s again. These were fluorescent banks several years ago. And this is a 2000 watt incandescent or tungsten light. And a strobe. It's an example of sometimes in studios, poke around, you never know what you're going to find. This is a comedian I photographed for a magazine. And I was just trying to come up with something different than here we are against a simple wall. And they had this rolling mirror in the studio and I got the shot, which I really like. All right, so you figured out what lights you want to use. Now we need to think about controlling the background. Because again, the purpose of using a studio is control. If you don't need control, why bother being in a studio? So single light, subject on the right against the wall, right against the background. We've got that shadow being cast from the light on the wall. You can see that the right side of the wall is brighter than the left side of the wall. Sometimes that's cool. I did this on purpose, but sometimes it's not. It just depends on what you want. So you want to think about perhaps setting things up in a way where the background can be lit separately from your subject. So here I have a background light and you can see a 5-foot octabank in the foreground. If you're using a single light on the background, especially on a white background, to make it feel white, think about the fall off. You can see that the middle is bright, but the outsides are fading to gray. That may be fine, and it's certainly easy to correct later, but just be aware of it. One light source is probably not enough to get a truly even white. If you want a truly even white, the way that we would traditionally do it is probably 4 lights, 2 on the left, 1 high, 1 low, 2 on the right, 1 high, 1 low, all at the background. And in a perfect world, I would actually have them into V flats, which are 4 by 8 sheets of foam core taped together. You bounce the lights into those to get a really even light. 2 lights on the left, 2 lights on the right, bounce that into the background. And then you can get a very, very even background, but you need a lot of space to do that and a lot of lights. That's 4 lights just on the background alone. Some of us may have that, some of us don't. There's always, there's other ways to do it like this, where it's nice and clean and white directly behind the subject, fades to gray. You fix that later in Photoshop if your goal is white, but just think about that and be aware of it. So to give you an idea of what all that's like, so here we are. This is me using Imaging Edge mobile to control the camera. That's why my phone is in my hand. Single light on me at the 5-foot octa, no light on the background. I'm far enough back that the background, even though it's white paper, looks gray. Here we are, everything the same, white background. The light on the background is metered at the same f-stop as the light on me. For those of you who don't use a light meter, if you're going to use strobes especially, I would really recommend it. I know more and more people don't, because you'll take a picture and look, take a picture, look, take a picture and look. It's a lot faster if you use a light meter, and you have a lot more control. So the light behind me here, like I said, metered at the exact same f-stop as the strobe on me, the main light, which means that the brightest spot, which is directly behind me, you're not really seeing. Here it is, the background light is 1 stop brighter, and here it is 2 stops brighter, 3 stops brighter, 4 stops brighter. The old rule of thumb, if you're going to try and make a clean white background, is to make it meter brighter than your subject. So if you're shooting it at 5.6, you might want to do 8.5 or 11 on the background, but you can see if you go too bright. So here, everything's pretty white, except the upper corners. But you can see if you look on my right cheek and on my left ear, you can see there's so much light on the background. It's effectively becoming a light source. And because it's so big, it's wrapping around and impacting the light on my subject, in this case, me. So the way to fix that is either to not make it 4 stops brighter, or to have more distance between your subject and your background. But just be aware of that. It's easier to fix your background to make it brighter later by not overexposing it this much than it is to try and correct for that light wrapping around. So here we are. You can see I use two umbrellas, left and right. They're both going. It's just the one on the right is a thinner black fabric. And you can see that now with even just 2 lights and an umbrella, it's a more even background. There is fall off top and bottom, you can see, but it's a much more even white than just 1 light behind. Same setup with no background light. Another thing I'm a fan of is a dark background, in this case, a black background with a single light. Paradoxically, if you put enough light on a black background, it will be lit. And what you get is this more dramatic fall off. So to me, it makes him look like a musician to me. He was an actor. But by lighting a black background, you get some really cool fall off. And if you light a black background with a color, in this case, red, so you get a red gel. You can get those at B&H. You can get packs of 1x1 gels. The red light on a black background becomes very, very saturated. So you get this really rich red that fades to that black. Same thing here, black V-flat with a strobe with this sort of teal green. You get that nice, super saturated color fading out. Same person on a dark blue background with a little bit of light. This is another example of, I happened to notice the sun and I liked it, so I opened the blinds. The light on the background is just the hard light from the sun coming in through the window. Sometimes the light that's there is super cool. Sometimes the sun does fun stuff. It's always worth being aware of what's happening and adjusting because something looks cool. I sometimes will get so much in my own head with an idea of what I want to do that I'll miss something that's better because I'm too focused on the plan. And it certainly, if you have a client and what you're trying to do is a very specific picture for a client or for whatever reason, you have to do that. But being able to be flexible and just adapt on the fly and see that something's cool and do that can be really, really useful. I don't have it in here, but I was doing a photo shoot for a magazine. And as we were about to move, I just noticed the window light was really beautiful. And I just brought my subject over to the window. We did like 6 frames with the window light. Then we moved on because we had no time. And the magazine ended up holding that story for another issue so that they could put that picture that we'd only did 6 frames of in front of the window on the cover. I wouldn't have gotten that cover if I hadn't been like, oh, you know what? That light looks cool. Let's just do something there really quick. So you never know. Studio with window light again. So this is studio with a projector spot. So if you're using a strobe or a hot light, depending on the hot light, you can get something that focuses the light, and then there's little gobos that you can drop in there that have patterns, and you can create different patterns with that projector. I think they're really, really fun. They can get overused and gimmicky, but you know, you got to play. Another way to get really saturated color is to have something, in this case, a green background. And then just like we did with the black background, you've got your green background, you put a light on it with a green gel. Again, the gels are sort of heat resistant, but not heat proof, acetate with a color. So green light on the green background, you get a more saturated green or a more saturated yellow. It's really a great way to get saturation. All right, so let's talk about controlling your light. We've talked about controlling your background. Now we're going to control the light in general. Obviously, this is a deep topic and we're only going to scratch the surface. There's a lot of light modifiers out there. Depending on the light modifier, it will work with window light or strobe or constant light, just depending on the situation, what you're using. Certainly gels and diffusion you can put on anything, although if you put them on a very hot light, they'll melt. Cookies and flags and scrims, reflectors, all of that can be used with anything. Soft boxes, umbrellas, gobos, barn doors, all that. Depending on the light, you can use it. I would recommend, if you're just starting, start with an umbrella, then a softbox or an octabox, and then move on from there. But an umbrella is relatively inexpensive and can be quite versatile. And then just to understand how all of those things differ. So the column on the left is a 5-inch reflector. A reflector is just the modifier that goes right on the light itself, reflects the light out. The middle is a 20-inch beauty dish. The right is a 5-foot octabank. So you can see top row, the light is about 18 inches below my head. You can see the shadow from my nose is up and the light feels a little weird, right? You almost never want to light from below your subject. Almost always you want to be a little bit ahead, a little bit higher than their head rather. If you look at the second row, it's about head height. The nose shadow is immediately to the right. Still feels a little weird. The 12 inches above head, now that's starting to feel more natural to me. And then 40 inches above head, which was as high as I could go in the space, I'm getting shadows under my eyes because it's too high. I'm getting the raccoon eyes. Then you can also see, if you look at the way that the light transitions from the highlight side to the shadow side, it's much harder with the 5-inch reflector, and then a little softer with the beauty dish, and then much softer with the octabank. I'm also in a space where light's bouncing around because there's white walls. So bear that in mind. But you can see often an octabank is going to be a more flattering light than a 5-inch reflector, for example. I mean, the difference between 5 inches and 5 feet is a lot. It's a lot of surface area, and it's a more flattering, softer light. You also might want to consider the light placement. So the left column, the light is immediately to my side. The middle column, it's a little bit in front of me, feathered sort of towards my left shoulder. And then on the right, it's even more in front of me, feathered towards my right shoulder. So our left on the far right, our right in the middle. You can see that the top row with the light to my side, if you're looking at the camera, it's not great, right? We're getting shadows in both eyes. Once you start turning your head a little bit, it gets a little bit better. And if I'm facing the light, it looks fine. The middle column, you can see the light, I think, is more flattering. And then the right column, it's a little similar to the middle, but you can see it feels a little different. But more importantly, because it's feathered more to camera left, it's hitting the background more. So I'm less able to control the background because my main light is hitting the background. Similar thing here. You can see the light is in the same spot relative to me. It's just which direction it's faced. Far left, it's feathered way off of me. It's just basically skimming in front of me, feathered towards my left shoulder, towards my head, towards my right shoulder. You can see what a difference it makes in the fill, on the background, even how the light feels on me and on my, as a person, as a portrait subject. Some of that too, you can see on the left, because the shadow side is so light, it's because the light is bouncing off the white wall and coming back and filling in. So you really want to think about your light placement and control. There are people that will tell you to never point a light directly at your subject. You always want to feather it. I'm not going to say that. I think it just depends on the situation, and you have to figure out what works for you. But think about it. Don't automatically point your light at your subject. You can try that and see, and then try feathering it and see what you like better. Every situation is going to be different. It's also going to be affected by the space you're in. And then we talked about studios, you know, ideally having a black walls, black ceiling. That can be a little bit of a bummer, but you do get more control. So on the left, I'm in a space, the fill light, the shadow side is just lit with the white walls of the room with the light bouncing around. Second from the left, I've added a white fill. The next one over, I've added black fill, and you can see what a dramatic difference that does, where I'm just stopping the light from bouncing that I don't want to bounce. So if I wanted more light there, I can add it, but I'm stopping the light from just bouncing around that I have minimal control on. And then on the far right, we have silver fill, which is much punchier and something I almost never use. But silver is much more reflective than white. And then we also, in terms of lighting, we have something called the inverse square law, and the relationship between your subject and your light affecting how soft it is. So on the left, the light is 3 feet from me. You can see the shadow side is more dramatic. The background is darker. The middle one, it's 6 feet away. The far right one, it's 10 feet away. You can see the background gets progressively brighter. That's because the fall off as the light moves away is less dramatic between me and the background because the light is further away. That's what the inverse square law says, is as you move something further away, the fall off is less dramatic. And if you move the light closer, the fall off is more dramatic. Also, a light that is closer is softer than a light that is further away. So if you look at the shadow edges, even though there's more fill bouncing around on the right, because of the way things wrap around, the edges of the shadow are harder because the light is relatively smaller. Even though it's still a 5-foot source, it's further away. So relative to me, it's harder. Just like the sun is enormous, much bigger than the Earth, but it's 93 million miles away. So it's effectively a hard light source. If we were closer to it, it would be a soft light source as we burn to a crisp. So just some other things to think about in terms of setting up and lighting. We've got an edge light on the left, main light on the right, nice big soft octabank. I often in studios will use just one 5-foot octa and just let the background go gray because I think it can be nice. I don't always want black, or I'm sorry, I don't always want white. You can see here. Sometimes I do want more control. So I've got a warm light on the left and a purple LED on the right. So incandescent there, you can see. And then I brought in the LED on the right. To get that kind of control, I had to put V flats around my subject because the space is too light colored and there was too much light bouncing around. Nice soft light. 2 strip lights, which are long and narrow lights, left and right, and then a light on the front. These are examples of what feels like a studio. This was done at the Javits Center at the Photo Plus Expo several years ago at the Sony booth. If you can control things, it's a studio. Edge light on the left, main light on the right, edge light on the left, main light on the right. This is an 8-foot octabank, so much larger. It can be a beautiful light source. Strip light on the left, octa on the right. You can see it here with the V flat background. 5-foot octa, edge light main light. So these are two lights from left and right going straight in. If he faces directly towards me, the light is terrible. For this to work, he has to be looking to the side. Warm fill. So a warm light on the right, oct on the left. Adding some blue gels, adding some dramatic blue gels. Sometimes you can shape the light just with what's there. So these are two V flats that are placed close together to make that slit. Edge light, main light, and here you can see sometimes an edge light is cool. Sometimes it's too much. In this case, I thought it was too much. And this version I did without the edge light, just with the softbox, I think is a better portrait. This is too much. I should have turned that edge light down. It's too bright. Edge light, no edge light. Same thing here. I don't love the edge light. I think this is a better portrait. And then I wanted to toss in a couple examples of studios that you can rent that you can control things and move things around, but a studio doesn't have to mean that it's just a plain space. There are studios you can rent where they're full of props or they're full of sets. If you have the time and the wherewithal, you could build a set in a studio. There are places, we were talking about one before, there's a place called Ready Set. There are places that will build sets for you, depending on your budget and your time. So this is a studio I rented out in LA that is designed to look like this home. But I can control the lights. I can move anything I want. Same thing, a different studio. This is window light coming in from the left, strobe. It's a studio. I can control things, but it's designed to look like a set. Same thing. This using a hard light made it feel more like daylight to me. So this feels like we're outside, but we're in a studio. All right. We went through a lot. Let's see if there are any questions. In the meantime, you can learn more about me and Sony, tonygale.com, Alpha Universe. All right. How's it going, Derek?
It's going wonderful. That was very, very, very thorough, as usual, Tony.
Well, I always think of things I might be leaving out, and then I have to talk really fast.
You went down to music, and that's one thing that I think everybody skips over when they talk about photographing in studio, but you can't have a photo shoot without music.
You know, especially for people who are nervous.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes me feel better with music, but for the people I'm photographing, to just be there and it's just the two of us talking or nobody talking and just silence and getting in their own heads.
Yeah, it takes the onus off you to create an environment of comfort and lets them kind of just go into their own groove, and then you can kind of do your own thing.
Yeah, and I have 12,000 songs on that Sony Walkman, digital Walkman. So if someone has something specific they want to hear, I at least have the genre, even if I don't have that artist.
You have something for everybody. Well, look, it looks like they are satisfied with what you've given them. And of course, if you do think of a question, Tony's a regular here. You know you're going to see him again shortly. So if you guys do think of anything, if the question doesn't strike you at the moment, or if you're not watching live and you're watching a replay on this, feel free to send your questions in at any time or join one of our live streams or come check Tony out in person. Next week, we'll be in Central Park, as he mentioned, checking out the beautiful waterfalls there. Let's hope the weather, well, we got the rain. So I hope the rain, that'll help the waterfalls. I don't know how long that effect lasts or.
Well, it's all artificial anyway. So they're not natural waterfalls. So probably for an hour, it's probably already done. They're beautiful waterfalls though. You wouldn't know that they weren't real.
Look, I never even knew about them. All the times I've been in Central Park, I never knew about them until one of your photo walks. So
you got to do some real exploring to find them.
Yeah. It's not one of the spots that everybody instantly goes to, like Bethesda Fountain and that whole Bow Bridge area there. So if you haven't been there, come along, check them out next week with us, next Monday. And looks like we wrap up a little early today, Tony. Huge thank you to you again, and to Tony for hosting, and to all of our viewers who are watching.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space in the books. Catch y'all next time.